Hello and welcome. I am Ben the Best 5 and I'm coming at you with yet more Kerbal Space Program content. As you can see, we have the exact same craft me and Spaceship were using last week, and in this week we are heading to our destination. We are in fact not landing there yet, but this will in fact be a detailed video describing how to get to a Vall orbit and how to operate such a big craft, etc, etc, etc. So for the purposes of this mission, and for this here first burn, we have in fact split our all of our fuel up into two different sections, and one section will completely extinguish, and that's what this burn here is doing. We're completely using up all the fuel in that first stage, or first set of fuel tanks, and once all that fuel is gone, we will then in fact ditch those tanks and then redock the engines back to the main body. This is just simply because it saves a lot of fuel doing it. Well, it gives us a whole bunch of delta V if we do that, rather than just burn it all at once, because expanding use stages is a great thing. And plus, it uses my trademarked, well, not trademarked, but my cool idea I came up with, which was an engine transplant. So we get to do that again, which I think is pretty cool. So yeah, the purpose of this first burn was to raise our orbit as much as possible, whilst using up as much of our, using up the first stage. That's the point of that, and then our second stage can be performed in such a way that it can then switch to the next set of fuel pods, storages, whatever you want to call them, and then we'll perform our second burn at Kerbin periapsis, or near to bring ourselves to a dual encounter. Now, as you can see here, this is the just the ditching of the old stage fairly routinely. We undock it like that, and then send it flying, and we don't need to worry about it because it will be ejected into a solar orbit, which means it will eventually crash into Kerbin or perhaps Juno, or one of those two planets, or even a slight chance of Dres. It will eventually hit one of them. However, we don't really need to worry about that because it will in fact be in such a weird and eccentric and high orbit in a space which has such a large amount of space, i.e. a solar orbit, that we can in fact just blatantly ignore its presence in the greater space of space, I guess you could say. Yeah, so here we are just docking, and yes, I am using RCS, even though I could have used the engines to do it and reaction wheels. RCS just makes it a lot easier. And you also might have noticed those are radiators there. Those are to help alleviate the effects of the engines, because those engines can actually get quite hot. So as a result, I put those radiators there to allow the engines to burn a little bit longer before they overheat. You'll also see me moving the engines down just because breaking it apart like that messed up the staging. And this is us now performing a much smaller burn, just simply because our first stage actually contained almost all of the delta V we needed to put ourselves on a Vall dual encounter, and from a dual encounter we will in fact then tweak our orbit so that we end up in a Vall orbit. This will be done obviously at a node and intersect at a node, so that a descending node or an ascending node, just so that we can get our inclination accurately adjusted, because that's going to be the main issue here, just because Joule has a very large sphere of influence, but its moons are quite small and have a relatively small sphere of influence. So because of that, we need to come in at the same plane as the that the moons are on, if we want to have any chance of getting a of getting a collision, or not collision, an encounter. As you can see here, this is just me setting up that maneuver. Now, it's important when coming up into Joule's atmosphere, because it's not atmosphere, sphere of influence. It's in fact important that you make sure that you come in so that you are in fact moving in the same rotation as the moons, or the way that Joule spins, if you want to actually enter an orbit without expending lots and lots of delta V. This is just because if you want to get an orbit into orbit around something like Vall, for example, and you're coming in from an orbit in the opposite direction, then to actually orbit Vall, you'd need to cancel out all of your velocity around Joule, and then put yourself into a Joule orbit spinning the same direction as Vall. So because of that, it's much better and easier if you just insert yourself into a Joule orbit moving in the same direction as the rest of the moons, which is also the same direction that that Joule is spinning in. It actually took me a while to work this out, because I figured if I came in the opposite direction, it would make it easier, because it would mean I'd get a slowed down gravity assist, but it just doesn't work that way. So yeah, there we are on a nice Vall Joule flyby. Also, an important thing to note is that when you are going to somewhere like Vall, you have to first target Joule and roughly guess, and then until you're actually in Joule's sphere of influence, that's when you can actually target something like Vall, because if you haven't done that, then you will in fact end up in all sorts of grief, worries and woes, just simply because your maneuver node will reset itself and will stop targeting, etc, 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 and that's not what you want. Anyway, for our purposes, we can't get a Vall intersect straight off the bat. However, I quick saved there, and I'll revert to that quick save. What I did there was I made a pretty bad maneuver. It's not going to be the actual one we use, however I kind of used it as a tool, just to basically see how much delta V it would cost us to enter a Vall orbit, and I did that, and I decided that that was an acceptable amount, so I even left in a quick bit of a loading screen just to symbolize that I quick saved back, and we're in fact not going to be using that maneuver. We're in fact going to be using the maneuver which puts us into an orbit which is close to Vall's. Just because if we're in an orbit which is close to Vall's, it means two things. It means we're more likely to get an encounter with Vall, but it also means that entering into a Vall orbit will be a lot cheaper. Just because if you're near to its orbit, then its gravity will do a lot to help you put it into orbit, as well as the fact that you won't have to cancel out all the extra delta V which is going towards all the extra velocity you have around Joule. You only have to really counter out the difference between your velocity and the velocity of Vall around Joule. And yeah, that's really why you want to end up into an orbit which is as close to Vall's as possible. It's also why if you are running low on delta V, you can get an encounter and use that encounter then to perform a gravity assist, which will bring you closer and closer and closer into Vall's orbit, or any celestial body's orbit, until you in fact reach a point where you're in fact basically in the same orbit, at which point getting into orbit is pretty easy. I know it's a bit off topic, but I know. I just felt like it was a good idea to talk about it. Anyway, we are entering an orbit of Joule, and now what we are going to do is we are going to in fact time warp around Joule until we get a naturally close encounter like we have here, because this encounter here is pretty close, and we can make an encounter really easily. Like, we don't even need to worry about being that precise, because we just want a low Vall encounter, and it in fact wasn't that far away, so now we can actually just perform a very small correction burn to put ourselves into a Vall orbital insertion, at which point we can then perform a relatively cheap, like under 1,000 meters, but in fact it's, can't read it on the screen there, I forgot how many it was, but it was very, you guys on YouTube will see, but as you can see it's a small amount of delta V compared to what could potentially be used. Anyway, we are here in Vall's sphere of influence, which means all we need to do now is perform a retrograde burn around Vall, which will drop our velocity to 1, which is slow enough that we can orbit Vall without leaving its sphere of influence, which is exactly what we want to do, because in the next mission, Spaceship will in fact be loading up the lander there, along with the buggy, and he will in fact be landing on the surface of Minmus, doing some cool stuff there, and then returning to the craft, and then returning our Kerbals back to home, safe and sound, after a long mission to Vall and back. However, once we in fact enter an orbit, our mission here is not quite done, because you may have remembered that there is in fact a garbage pod on board this craft, and it is designed to be dropped off full of all sorts of waste that Kerbals produce on long-term missions. So as a result, now that we are in Vall orbit, it will in fact be time to ditch that. Yeah, it's just in a little cargo module there, and it's that thing full of ore. Now originally, I did in fact intend for this to propel itself away, using some monopropellant. However, I discovered the hard and awkward way that I in fact left no monopropellant actually inside it somehow. I must have messed that up while I was producing it, but that is okay, we don't need to really worry about it. Anyway, thank you for watching the video. Please check out my channel and subscribe. Subscriptions really do help me out, they help support the channel. Please leave a like if you want to see more content like this. Please check out Spaceship's videos and his contributions to this collaboration, and stay tuned for next week where he lands using the vehicle we built on the surface of Minmus. Other than that, thank you for watching. You guys who watch this stuff really do support my channel. Other than that, check out the links where I'll link the full playlist to the entire set of missions me and Spaceship did, and have a great day. See ya later.